Well, welcome everyone. I am Chet Kerr, a board member of the Irvington Historical Society, and I welcome all of you to this presentation we're doing today about Alexander Jackson Downey. A couple of preliminary things to mention. We are recording this presentation. We'll be posting it up on our website in a couple of days, so you can always turn back and look at it again if you're interested. We will have some time at the end for questions and answers. If you have any questions, please put them in the chat. And at the end, we'll go through the questions and our speaker will do her best to answer them as she can. So it's my great pleasure today to welcome as our presenter, Janet Foster, who is an architectural historian and historic preservation consultant with over 30 years of experience. Janet studied at the Columbia University Historic Preservation Program and then founded Acroterion, a preservation consulting firm in 1983. She had the opportunity to study hundreds of buildings in New Jersey, New York, and Pennsylvania through preparation of National Register nominations, historic structure reports, historic building surveys, and other types of projects. Janet is a teacher and a lecturer on historic architecture. She helped to develop the curriculum at the Drew University Community Continuing Education Program in historic preservation. From 2002 through 2012, she worked as the Associate Director for Urban Planning and Historic Preservation Programs at Columbia University's Graduate School of Architecture, Planning, and Preservation. And she continued her work at Columbia University as an adjunct professor in the Historic Preservation Program. Janet is also an author. She's published numerous articles and books focused on architecture, and among them, Legacy Through the Lens, Medham's Architecture, Building by the Book, Pattern Book Architecture in New Jersey, and the Queen Anne House, America's Victorian Vernacular. We're very, very lucky to have Janet with us today. So please join me in welcoming her to our program. And Janet, with that, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Green share now. Thank you so much, Chet, for that introduction. Okay. And okay. All right. Can you hear me? How are we doing, Chet?
We can hear you. We don't see your share yet, but
you don't see my share yet. Okay, let me try to fix that. Sorry about that. Let's go back. Recording. Let's see. Try again. Share screen. Yes. Share. Okay.
Okay.
Does that look?
Yeah, just.
Yep.
Perfect.
Okay. Thank you. I'm sorry for that tiny glitch. And thank you for having me to talk about one of my favorite topics, which are H.A. Downing and the pattern book revolution. We're going to have a rather long and lively talk, so I'm going to talk fast. And as Chet said, if you have a question, slip it into the chat for him, and we will delve into that in about 50 minutes or so. As you know, pattern books are books, published books of designs for architecture. And they have been used in this country for just about as long as they existed. We have 18th century American houses that use pattern book details, often on a traditional vernacular house type. This is a wonderful folk art painting that shows a pretty traditional American wooden house, but with a very fancy doorway. And you have to say, how did that get to New England? Because of pattern books, because of published ways to show designs, sometimes relatively recent. You know, this is published 1774. That folk art drawing shows us something in 1795. Other times in the 18th century, there's quite a gap between publication and appearance. The Batty Langley book of designs, which talks about this center arch. We might call it a Palladian window. He actually called it a Serliana motif. That's published in the 1750s. It's 25 years later that it shows up, for instance, at Morristown National Historic Park as the doorway model of a very fine house. And yes, George Washington slept here. There's not a chance in the world that a country carpenter from Morristown, New Jersey in the 18th century had a clue about a Serliana, about a Palladian whatever, about the Greek orders, unless he had seen one of these published sources about classical design. Pattern books were used for whole houses as an influence. Here we have a very famous example of an actual Palladian design shown at the top, and how it was executed in colonial South Carolina at the house we now call Drayton Hall. The Palladian design is all about symmetry, about the main block and then the flanking wings for service areas. And indeed, historically, Drayton Hall had those service wings. You can see on either side of the big house. They are gone now. They are being excavated archaeologically, but there's very much about this house that is directly inspired by Palladian design. And again, no workman in South Carolina in the 1740s had been to Italy. They know about this through books of designs that were probably owned by the Drayton family and other high-class family, because these are very expensive books in the 19th century. As we get to the end of the 18th century, we see the rise of periodicals, of not just newspapers, but magazines, if you will, although they didn't look much like what we think of as a magazine. But here's one that appeared 1788, the Pennsylvania Agricultural Magazine. And as we're going to see, agricultural magazines, periodicals about farming were incredibly important through the 19th century because most Americans lived on a farm, were in part of a rural environment. So these had wide circulation. But here's a wonderful example showing a model farm with the model farmhouse, which is a big old 5-bay center hall, colonial type of dwelling, dressed up with a rather crudely drawn, but nonetheless probably more or less accurate representation of a designed door enframement with a pediment similar to those we saw in the Batty Langley pattern books from earlier. And here the model farm has people in it, and it has a guy herding some cattle and some people riding horses and the happy family holding hands under a tree, which seems a bit leisurely for working on an 18th century farm, but nonetheless, it's an image both of the house, of the farm, and of sort of rural prosperity and happiness. And we're going to see that when we get to A.J. Downing, this is very much in his DNA. The first American pattern book to be created was by Asher Benjamin, a Connecticut carpenter. And Asher Benjamin knew of English pattern books. He worked for Charles Bulfinch, who was an English architect working in Boston in the early 19th century. And Asher Benjamin realized that some of the ideas that were coming into the United States then about classical architecture were more unusual, shall we say, for a country builder. So he created the Country Builder's Assistant, the first pattern book written by an American and published in America. He then wrote another book about a decade later, The American Builder's Companion, first issued in 1806, and reprinted for over 20 years. And here's a later edition of The American Builder's Companion. Asher Benjamin, his first book showed, he has it looks like a geometry book. If you've ever seen a really old builder's book, it's telling the builder exactly how you scribe out and then cut or plane complicated things like stair railings, like the angles for decorative moldings. His drawings are simplistic to the point of being crude, as you can see in both of these, but they say something to the builder who would have already had lots of experience from an apprentice system in building houses and churches and other kinds of civic buildings. So this made sense to him. Asher Benjamin has a few what we've called designs. Mostly it's that kind of shorthand for builders. But here's his famous plate 25 from the Country Builder's Assistant, which shows a two-story center hall house with a big hipped roof and a Cirliana or Palladian motif in both the upper floor and the lower floor. There is a house in the upper right, which seems to have been built using that plan in Andover, Massachusetts. The house lower left is the Harrison Gray Otis House, a house museum now in Boston, which was designed and built by Charles Bulfinch. I did mention that Charles Bulfinch was Asher Benjamin's boss. And so Asher Benjamin pretty much took the idea of this very large, very fancy, very expensive house from 1795-96 and drew it up and put it in his book of 1797. Copyright law was virtually non-existent at this point. And yes, we will see ideas and images were traded back and forth between architects, builders, publishers of pattern books. Variations were made and new builders created new things from it. So it's a very evolving, organic thing. It is hard to say in many cases where the original is, although I think it's pretty clear in this case where the original is, but it's been simplified for a country builder, for an everyman. Asher Benjamin did a lot to promote the federal style. This is really his period, the 1810s, 20s, when Georgian gives way to a lighter classicism. Maybe one of the most characteristic elements of federal style is the decorative fanlight, either in wood or often in leaded glass. It's a transom basically, but has this lovely, delicate decoration. Asher Benjamin continued to publish pattern books pretty much through his lifetime. His last pattern book, he shifted out of federal to Greek Revival, which was the next iteration of classical architecture to become popular across the United States in the 1830s. Asher Benjamin passed away in 1843. When he died, his estate was worth about $40,000. That is a lot of royalties because he had a lot of books that went to a lot of editions, and every country carpenter seemed to have had one. So he certainly demonstrated that pattern books and books of design could become a popular press item. Unlike those expensive English imports in the 18th century, he's really the one saying, you know, if you do it right, you can make money on this, because he certainly didn't make that kind of money building houses. This is the enviable, as an author, the enviable status of having your book go to reprint and still getting money for it. The Greek Revival was also promoted by a guy named Menard Lefebvre. Again, a lot of the designs are not full building designs. They are details of how to execute the all-important columns in the different orders, which are foundational to the Greek Revival style. Here are just two plates that show a Doric in the upper left and a Corinthian column in the lower right, and how they were used in real buildings and published by Asher Benjamin for further use in other buildings around the United States. We see the use of classical columns, of a prominent center pediment as being also defining features of the Greek revival style. And in a way, the Greek revival is a bridge between classicism and romanticism, because it's being used here not because people think that their houses actually look like Greek temples. I don't think anybody thought that, but they thought the idea of living in a Greek temple would somehow be supportive of democracy in a new nation, where they understood this was a new experiment in democracy, and the Greeks had been the fathers of democracy, so to speak. So they're expressing a kind of patriotism in the United States by referencing back to Greek revival style. But this changes dramatically in about the late 1830s, 1840, with these two guys. Alexander Jackson Davis on the right, and Andrew Jackson Downing on the left. Andrew Jackson Downing is named for Andrew Jackson, who was the hero of the Battle of New Orleans at the time he was born and would later become president in the United States. Andrew Jackson Downing was born in Newburgh, New York. His father was a nurseryman, a man who cultivated and grew plants, mostly for an audience of wealthy estate owners up and down the Hudson River. There was an emerging sense of landscape design, if you will, and in a great interest in collecting plants and using plants to showcase one's knowledge of the world, or to provide certain aesthetic features like a grove of trees or a secluded grotto or something like that. There was this sense, and it's mostly coming out of England and the Romantic movement. However, Andrew Jackson Downing's father died when he was about 8 years old. His older brother, who was already an adult, became his guardian, if you will, and his older brother took over the family business. And Andrew and his older brother Charles, remained very close through their life. And for a time, Downing worked in the family nursery. And through that, he became familiar with a lot of horticultural magazines from particularly England. So he was well versed in the literature of what we would describe as an emergent horticulture interest and landscape architecture design interest. But as far as formal schooling was, Andrew Jackson Downing went to school till he was about 15, and then was working up and down the Hudson River with his brother with the family business. And he was apparently a very keen observer, a very sponge-like, wide reader, and was very interested in what was going on in New York City and looking at the wealthy people who were his neighbors and trying to learn as much as he could about them. And he learned a lot, apparently. Meanwhile, just a little bit older, Alexander Jackson Davis is living in New York City, and he was an artist. He was trained in the arts. He had certainly a talent for art and design, but he first went into the printing trade and sketched out lithographs and things that would be printed, but he also worked as an apprentice in an architect's office. And because that's how you did it in the early 19th century, he became a trained architect, again, without benefit of what we would call a formal education, but a lot of hands-on education about building and design. The two of them would meet and establish a partnership for about 10 years that was very significant for American architecture. When Davis, A.J. Davis, the architect, was in his early 30s. He was working with Ithiel Town, also trained, apprenticed as an architect, but even more famous as a bridge builder and an engineer. So Ithiel had the technical experience, if you will, and he hired Alexander Jackson Davis in part to be his designer and draftsman. And he's designing something in the Greek Revival style with the pediment and the columns, but look how beautiful his rendering is. I mean, Davis was absolutely an artist, and he did these fabulous presentation watercolors of buildings initially in the 1830s as standalone objects. They are not so much in a landscape as they are just pristine objects all by themselves. And he, at the same time, Downing wrote some articles first about horticulture and plants. And then when he was 26 years old, he decided he was ready to write his own book. And he did, about landscape architecture, a treatise on the theory and practice of landscape architecture in America. And it's an enormous volume, and it covers lots and lots and lots of native plants and what their uses are and how to propagate them and how one might arrange them. And it's clearly very technical from a man who really knows his stuff about plants. But the frontispiece includes this beautiful illustration, which is certainly along the Hudson River, and there are the mountains in the background to prove it. But he inserts this romantic, fanciful building and the people frolicking in the lawn, like we saw as far back as the 18th century magazine illustration. For him, this may be a view of a real building, but it is the landscape that is really compelling to him. So we have people with two different points of view of how to get to romanticism in America, but they're quickly converging. Davis was an artist, and as so often happens, as an artist, he's not really a businessman. He was creative, but apparently fairly terrible at keeping accounts and keeping books. But he imagined that some of his designs in the romantic or picturesque style, in the Gothic style, such as are seen here, would be of interest to people. And he proposed a book, which again had these beautiful watercolor drawings of houses, a little bit more landscape, but clearly the houses are the predominant element of this, beautifully tinted and lighted. And there's no such thing as color printing at this time, right? So he would create plates that then needed to be watercolored by hand for every single plate, which I'm pretty sure was done by women toiling over tables in a factory in downtown Manhattan. Nevertheless, beautiful drawings. He intended it to be a book. It was way too expensive, and very few copies of this were ever printed. It's often referred to as the most important book about architecture that was never published in America, because there are sections of the book that survive, but no one knows of a complete bound version that got a cover on it and was in circulation. This was put out over a couple years, but a very beautiful book. And people, at least in New York, knew about it, and had seen some of Davis's drawings. At this point, he was able to take his fame as an artist and an illustrator, and he received a commission for the little Gothic cottage on the left, the gatehouse at Blythewood, which is up in Annandale, New York. It did not survive into the 20th century, but it was, as we shall see, very much reproduced over time. and brought Davis certainly fame and the ability to do other larger commissions. So he did have a good architectural practice for a time, but the book didn't work for him the way he might have anticipated. Here's another drawing he did for Blythewood, where he ended up designing the whole estate and the gatehouse and the caretaker's house and a number of accessory buildings. It's recently been taken over by Bard, and it's sometimes open to the public at this point. It's obviously quite a beautiful setting on the Hudson River, but he's showing here his use of lattice trellis work. Forget about those big, heavy Greek columns. He thinks the way to hold up a portico or a porch is with these much more delicate, often iron. Instead, wood would be extremely fragile. Usually iron, cast iron work, which is a new material at this point, but a way of expanding the house into the landscape via a really big porch. And that's a very important, again, romantic ideal for the 19th century. When Downing meets Davis, this is what happens. Downing meets him because Downing is in New York and trying to learn all these new things. And he says something like, wow, that's really great. You can see the landscape from in the house. And Davis says, well, yes, that's lovely. But Downing, remember, has worked for the family business for years. Says, you know, we could publish that in a much cheaper way. Forget your hand illustrated, beautiful drawings. We could make a nice little lithograph of that and publish it, and then people would get your idea better. I was not there. I don't know exactly how they said it, but clearly the conversation went something like that. And Davis said, well, okay, fine, that's saying, sure, why not? And so this is the open lattice, a little bit different design, but the open lattice porch detail that Downing publishes in his second book. His first book is all about landscape. His second book is about cottage residences, because he's met Davis and he says, you know, you have really cool ideas for interesting houses that would ornament the landscape. So he puts them together and creates a book of designs. And they do have an influence on American architecture all over the country, as far as a railroad can go in the 1840s and 50s and 60s and into the 70s, is how far Downing's designs went, because he did it in black and white, he did it cheaply, and he did it very simply. It's not a book for builders the way Asher Benjamin was. It doesn't have precise directions, but it has whole house ideas. So in the lower left here, we have a house, the Delamater House in Rhinebeck, that was designed by Davis. It was built in 1842 to 44, so it was designed probably a little before then. He used the very similar design to create a house in Llewellyn Park, New Jersey, which is shown above it some years later. But Davis and Downing collaborated to put that house into cottage residences to publish it. And here's the illustration of that from 1842 as the sort of the ideal of English or rural Gothic style. And it's how Americans learned to appreciate this, because if you compare this kind of house to the square, solid, colonial house with a 5-bay center hall and perhaps an ornamental doorway from an English pattern book, this is pretty exciting. It has the steep roof, it has applied ornament to give it more character, it has a porch. They all have a porch, whereas the colonial house did not. This is trying to bring the house into the landscape. Both of these built examples show the use of board and batten, and we'll talk about that a little later, which is vertical siding. It's illustrated with stone because Downing was very insistent that houses be connected to the landscape. And if they are in a wooded area, they could be made of wood. If they're an area where there's a lot of stone, they should be made of stone. If they needed to be of the earth, because he's still very concerned, very primary in his use of landscape as a setting. But that particular image, the Gothic cottage, gets loose, shall we say, from the Downing book. It's probably the most popular illustration in that cottage residences. It appears in the top image in American Agriculturalist. Remember I said agriculture magazines were important? American Agriculturalist is one of the longest published American periodicals. It still is extant. It's talked about in the 19th century, it talked about how to raise pigs, how to graft apples, what to do, in crossbreeding peas in your garden. I mean, it had a lot of practical advice about farming, a lot of modern scientific farming techniques, and it often had articles about ideal housing, because both Downing and Davis were concerned about housing in the United States, not from a financial standpoint, but that they thought most of it was ugly and needed to be improved. And of course, the ideal way to improve it is to build Gothic cottages and other romantic style buildings, such as they are designing, so that people would appreciate, would have a design that could be appreciated perhaps by the passerby on the road, which you might be as you look at this American Agriculturalist image and you see this farmhouse seems to have a fountain in front and swans swimming in the lake and prize cows, et cetera, et cetera. That's 1848 when that is used here. So that's 6 years after cottage residences. Not unlike Asher Benjamin's pattern books, that image is still showing up in 1873 in a more local agricultural periodical called Rural New York. There it is again. At this point, that house design is 40 years old. I mean, that's pretty amazing, but it had such an influence on 19th century taste, 19th century design, and that particular image just caught the public's imagination, and that is absolutely a collaboration between Andrew Jackson Downing and Alexander Jackson Davis, to the point that when Irvington is platted in 1850 as a development, we see up in the corners two designs which first appear some years later in cottage residences. There's our favorite Gothic cottage, the Downing, or the Davis original design. Oops, sorry. There. And then we have another version of the Gothic cottage as well. Here's a slightly different one, the symmetrical bracketed cottage, also from the Architecture of Country Houses, which is a somewhat later publication of Downing, 1850, but continuing that collaboration between him and Davis to promote picturesque houses often with Gothic details, even if only modest, like a couple of pointed arch windows in the upper floor, or always a steep peaked crossbeam, in the center of the house. The design was so popular, it appears all over the country. To me, the most jaw-dropping find was on the lower right. This was Fort Dales, Oregon. Oregon is not even a state yet, but it has an army facility, an army fort. And the officers' quarters, they apparently picked up a copy of Downing on the way west and said, yes, that would make a really good example, make a really good way to house the officer at Fort Dales. And it is still there. You can see the board and batten siding, and in fact, their windows are entirely intact. It is just a remarkable built example of Downing being used across the country. This is the other house that is in the upper part of the Deering map for laying out Irvington. Cottage may be built of wood, and it is a cottage residence known as a small gate lodge. Those steep peaked gables across the front, often with barge board, which is what we call the trim. Gingerbread is a Christmas confection. It is not an architectural term, even though I know people say that. Oh, I'm sorry. And I know what you mean when you say it, but let's be correct and call it barge board, BARGE BOARD, sometimes verge board, VERGE BOARD. But barge board is the more accepted terminology of what that decorative stuff is, that if you happen to have a house with it on, you know, always requires painting and patching. It's a phenomenal maintenance nightmare, but it does add the right picturesque quality to these houses that are not imitative of European cottages, but certainly suggestive of something old, established in the landscape, established in the country. And they are houses that are surprisingly big and comfortable. And there was a lot of concern when you see the floor plans for laying out the design that would be appropriate for different income levels. There are small cottages, there are big houses, all of which are predicated on the balloon framing system, which was a very modern framing system in the 1840s. Prior to this, buildings were constructed with what we call heavy timber framing, where heavy timber, giant thick timbers were sawn and notched with mortise and tenon joints and put into place. A very sturdy construction method, rather time consuming, did not require nails, so perfect for frontier colonial America. But as industrialization progressed, it also affected building materials and building construction. By the 1840s, nails can be mass produced. Lumber is now being cut in uniform sizes, sort of approximately 2 feet by, or 2 inches by 4 inches, and 8 foot or 16-foot length. So we retain that measurement now. And it was possible for someone who had not gone through a 7-year apprenticeship to learn to build a heavy timber frame house, to put together a house in much less time, for much less labor, for much less wood. And that got to be more important as the United States expanded westward into the Midwest states that didn't have as much wood as the East Coast. This is a wonderful image from the frontispiece of a pattern book from 1850 showing the workmen rather improbably wearing their vests and collars, but certainly the high hat, which we might associate with Abraham Lincoln, was absolutely a hard hat, if you will, and was very typically used by builders, master builders, architect builders, construction people who were on site. These hats are hard, they are stiff, and Lincoln's use of the top hat was not to identify with opera-going gentry, but to identify with the skilled workmen who would be head of the building crews across the United States. So this shows some of their tools. This is the framing of a balloon framing house in the background, and there's a completed house on the right with the irregular profile that the Romantic Revival style loved so much. Other pattern books began to be produced in the wake of Downing's tremendous success with publishing this. And more they show details of framing, such as you see on the right side here, how you actually put the thing together, and details. This Samuel Sloan was a Philadelphia architect. He published a book in 1852 with a lot of similar Gothic and then Italianate style buildings and a lot of decorative barge board. Now, is that decorative barge board handmade by artisans named Geppetto? No, it is not. It is manufactured by the yard in factories with the new jigsaws and lathes and other materials. And you might take the design if you run a woodworking factory, you could take the design out of a pattern book, make lots and lots of board feet of decorative barge board, and sell it to a builder to apply to a new house, or perhaps to upgrade an existing house with these decorative, irregularly shaped wooden pieces. Two wonderful drawings, and this one in particular in the lower left, house in Saratoga, seems to have used pretty literally the design from the architecture of country houses by Downing in 1850. In the 1850s, we see Davis doing a little bit of a crossover, and he becomes involved in Llewellyn Park, which is in New Jersey. You know I'm from New Jersey, so you know I'm heavily a fan of New Jersey architecture. But Llewellyn Park is the first planned suburb in the United States, planned to be out of the city. It's outside of New York City, outside of Newark. It had public green space. It had lots of 10 acres, so good size lots, which meant that this was an enclave for the wealthy. It still survives. It's still an enclave for the wealthy. It's still a gated community. Davis helped lay out this entire subdivision, though, and he designed the buildings for it. This is the gatehouse, which still stands, and he designed several houses, which still stand. He, in fact, lived there. A.J. Davis had his own country house way up here in Eagle Rock Way. Sadly, it burned down at the turn of this century and is no longer extant. But he's experimenting with landscape design rather than architecture because he's learned quite a bit from his friend, Mr. Downing. Here are a couple of houses that he did in Llewellyn Park: Castlewood, the Gatehouse, his own house, Wildmont, and the Ramble. The Ramble was open space with paths and walking trails through it. It's also still extant and really is described as the prototype for Central Park. Davis was influenced by Downing in his interest in public open space. But we digress for just a moment. These great castles, because Downing and Davis turned from just Gothic cottages to something a bit more grand. Castles are very important in the Romantic Revival movement. Castles figure prominently in Sir Walter Scott novels, which were one of the great popular press items of the period. Richard Brown, Domestic Architecture, published in London 1829, is a pattern book from England that showed both modest cottages that you could build and also illustrated great mansions like this one, like this turreted fantasy, because they could draw it in there, and people sort of enjoyed that. Mr. Downing, as I said, moved around the rich and famous who had estates up and down the Hudson River, and more or less across from his father's nursery, which was just north of Newburgh, there was the estate of the DeWitt family, who were very wealthy, in part because of the sugar plantations they owned in the Virgin Islands, and from an old Dutch family, and they had tons of land and real estate to traffic in. And the DeWitts were very well connected American aristocracy and were related by blood to President John Adams and President John Quincy Adams. And their lovely daughter, Carolyn, caught the eye of Andrew Jackson Downing, just, a self-made landscaper. And they married in 1836, which is a charming story. I wish I knew more about that. Using her money, the Downings built and moved into this castle. Now, Downing did not go to Europe until about 1850. He's never seen a real castle. What he has seen are drawings in these English architecture books. And his own house certainly reflects this, which he would have seen. We're sure he would have seen the brown pattern book from England. And what he created is an extravagant castle that is published both in his pattern book and in the landscape, his treaty and theory and landscape, because he had a lot to say about how he landscaped his own home. Here's a rare photograph of that. Unfortunately, it was demolished in 1922, but Downings did live in a castle on the Hudson River. And there were other images of castles published in American journals. We have two examples here, one from the American Agriculturalist. Clearly, this has nothing to do with improved farming in the United States and everything to do with just a feature in that magazine to charm you and make you aware of what castles looked like in Europe, because a lot of Americans are still not able to travel to Europe to see these things. But there's a lot of romanticism about castles. And so they are published, and people see this is how Americans see them. They are not watching HGTV. They are not able to see this in movies. They are seeing it probably through agriculture and horticultural magazines. George Vail was a member of Congress from Morris County, New Jersey, where I live. When you are a member of Congress, everything becomes part of a file, or it should be. And this is in George Vail's diaries from the time he was in Congress. And he's clearly doodling one day, and he's drawing a little castle. And he proposes that he's designing a new house for himself. He'd really like a new house, and maybe he would like to build a castle. Well, then he found out how much a castle cost, and this is what he actually built, which is from Downing, from cottage residences from 1842. He finally built it in 1850, a very exact reproduction of the cottage villa in the bracketed style from Downing, which is an adaptation, of course, from the Davis center gable bracketed cottage. It uses a local stone. You can just about see it's quite purplish in hue. It's not a very good building stone, but he made it work for this cottage because it is made of the material of the land on which it stands. John Riddell went in the Davis category of publishing a book of designs for cottage and villa architecture. John Riddell was English, trained in England, and came to the United States and published this book. Again, his fatal flaw is it's hand painted. So it's a beautiful, huge book that was very expensive, and he didn't produce too many of them and certainly didn't sell a lot of them. But it also clearly had some influence generally. We have a house called Wisteria Lodge. It's its nickname because of all this beautiful wisteria. And one detail to notice in the painting, in the watercoloring, he's shown this standing seam metal roof, which was a relatively new technology at this point. And every other panel of the metal is painted a different color to sort of give it a really fun circus tent attribute. And lo and behold, this black and white photograph, which is a detail of the house above it, mid-19th century photograph shows indeed that was painted that way. So these images have everything to do with design and detail in American houses. I mentioned board and batten siding. You have boards, you put a batten or a thin strip over them to cover the joint between the two boards. We sometimes see it in barns these days, and now, of course, it's being revived in modern materials in modern houses. But this was a way of enhancing the verticality, the vertical lines of Gothic architecture when translated into an American two-story wooden house. And the Campbell House is a very literal translation of a published design from Samuel Sloan, using, it doesn't show up so much here, but on the side, using board and batten, and again, a lovely decorative barge board trim that is also detailed in Sloan. Here's an example of board and batten being used on the most modest of little buildings in a country town in 1860 in Pennsylvania, but that detail marked it as au courant instead of boring old clapboard. The Bridget Smith house was built, it's a double house built from miners. There was iron mining in northern Morris County in the 19th century. These are the oppressed proletariat in a big way, but their company housing had board and batten siding, which I find astonishing and wonderful, and a front porch, because they're trying to make these look like the kind of romantic revival dwelling that was being promoted as the ideal for middle-class housing. So the romantic ideal is circulated from pillar to post in a number of ways, but it is this house, the three-bay center gable front porch house, that becomes, I would say, one of the archetypes of American romantic revival architecture. And it all clearly goes back to Downing's publications and his influence from Davis. There are some variations, the triple gable, for instance, and this gets us into one of our conundrums about dates and copyright. The Hermitage in Hohokus, New Jersey, Bergen County, New Jersey, just a little south of you all, was remodeled from a Dutch stone farmhouse in the mid-1840s and published that same year by William Ramlett in his book called The Architect. That may mean that Ramlett, who was in New York, did the alterations. It may mean that Ramlett knew about the alterations that were happening and stole the idea and quickly published the book, because the timing is very close to have actually been the architect of record and written the book, although it's possible. And then there are the examples from Downing, Country House, and from Sloan in Philadelphia, the model architect, which are also very similar, L-plan, bracketed, in the Downing instance, triple gabled house. Is everybody looking at a common source that has not appeared in the literature about common sources for these things? Is everybody having the same idea at the same time? Are they copying furiously from each other? Don't know. But the L-plan house that we see there with the front projecting gable and a prominent side wing is really an invention of the Romantic Revival period. If you think of colonial houses, they are square, they are boxes. They may have additions out the back, but they never have original L-plan formations. Part of that is because it's very hard to do that in heavy timber framing. Heavy timber will resist you doing that the entire way. But it is, I always say in my lectures, if you can show me an authentic 18th century house that has a real L plan with the L projecting in the front, hasn't been modified, then I owe you $10, and I'd love to know about it. So far, I haven't had to shell out for that. American Agriculturalist, again, one of those great periodicals that lasts through the 19th century into the 20th century, shows ideal farmhouses. And sure enough, there's an L-plan house. And sure enough, if you go to farm country, you will see plenty of farmhouses like that. The one in the upper right here is missing a porch that would fill in the L, but otherwise is pretty much intact. Downing also introduces an Italianate style, which Gothic was predominant in his work, but Italianate is meant to evoke sunny Italy and Tuscan vacations, characteristic of a tower or a belvedere, a lookout on top. And again, this irregular front-facing form, the front-facing L, is very much part of Downing's picturesque aesthetic that does come from Davis. Here, the small sketch is Downing, in Downing's hand, his original sketch for that house, what it should look like. And then he took it to his friend, Mr. Davis, and said, yeah, you have to draw this up so it looks good. And then we'll copy it and put it into cottage residences. And Davis was very obliging and used his artistic skills and created this. You can see he added lattice porches and lovely, awnings over the door and a more robust entry. But it is Downing's concept for an L-plan house as improved and published. And this is Davis's drawing. And then the way it gets translated by the lithographer back here is a little simpler, a little cleaner, because it's hard to get the shading nuances into a mass publication. Here's another Italian style villa from the Country House book of 1850 by Downing. And the country house, Italianate, becomes again a very popular part of mid-19th century expression in American domestic architecture. Towers, very big part of that design. And also the cubicle house with the lookout on top, the belvedere, which means beautiful view. In Italian, that was considered sort of the height of style in the Italian interpretation of mid-1850s. More examples of the Italianate style house, sometimes suburban, sometimes rural. It's a big square, kind of like big old colonial houses, but it's so dressed up with brackets and the belvedere and the beautiful porch that it's more romantic in that guise. Downing drowned, very sudden death in 1852 in a steamboat accident on the Hudson River. He was 37 years old. He and his wife had that big castle in Newburgh. They had no children. He was in the midst of several projects at the time of his death. And it was a real shock because everybody knew how influential he had been on what they called the taste of Americans, particularly none more than Calvert Vaux, because Calvert worked for Downing for about 18 months before Downing died. Calvert was an English trained architect. As I said, Downing went to England in about 1850 after he put the architecture of country houses to bed to be published. He wanted to see buildings in Europe. He wanted to see parks and landscapes in England. And while he was there, he met Calvert Vaux, a very young architect, and he convinced Calvert to come home with him, to come back to the States, work with him, because Calvert Vaux could draw and would work. Up to this point, Downing is working solo in his landscape business and writing and doing all these design things. And also apparently he was quite the host, and he and Carolyn had parties every night. He was very, very engaged, busy man, living life to the fullest. So when he died suddenly and leaves young Calvert in charge of the firm, I think it's fair to say Calvert Vaux was very broken up. It was another several years before Calvert paired up with another English architect working in America called Frederick Withers. They together published one pattern book called Villas and Cottages. They published it in 1864, which was maybe not the best year in United States history to be publishing about building, but a simple suburban cottage. And this is interesting because this is not a Downing design, but it is a very good prototype of what becomes the next generation of extraordinarily popular suburban housing. And we see the 3-bay side hall plan house emerge all over the United States in suburbs and small towns as the preferred building method. It has an antecedent from 1854, it was published in the Horticulturist, but it seems to not really have gathered popular acclaim until after Calvert Vaux put his imprint on it. And again, continued to be published in variations. Here's an example from 1833. Before his death, though, Downing, whose real passion was landscape, had been lobbying that the United States needed to have better parks. It was fine that people had big yards, but it wasn't the same as a designed public park. And he really had the ear of a number of people in New York City, including Horace Greeley, who had the newspaper, to say we should be lobbying for a central park in New York City. And indeed, that came to fruition, and it was Frederick Law Olmsted and his former partner Calvert Vaux who ended up winning the competition design and designing Central Park, using ideas, though, that Andrew Jackson Downing had promoted for years through Horticulturalist and some of his other writings. So this is very much a landscape legacy of Downing, carried out by Vaux. At the time of his death, Downing was also involved in a redesign of the Washington Mall. President Millard Fillmore contacted him and said, yeah, this whole straight line L'Enfant plan thing isn't working for us. We're in the romantic age. We want you to make it better. And this, I apologize, is a terrible copy. It's the best I can do. But it shows curving paths, and it's really predates the designs for Central Park, but puts into print form the ideas of this curvilinear landscape design that would become Central Park, that would become Llewellyn Park, and which was never executed, partly because Downing died, partly because Congress didn't appropriate money, partly because the Civil War intervened, and then partly because this went back out of fashion, and the mall design we have now is much more classical revival, the Macmillan plan of the early 20th century. Near Irvington is the knoll, which became a big estate on the Hudson River. You will know it as Lyndhurst. This part of Lyndhurst was the knoll. Both of these were designed by Davis, one of his early country house commissions in the Gothic revival castle style. The first house, the first version of this, dates from 1838, so it was a very early example of Gothic. A later owner, George Merritt, brought Davis back, and he designed substantial additions, redesigned the interior, and that's largely what you see today if you go to visit Lyndhurst. And it's a very rare example of the same architect modifying his own work a generation apart. But the funny thing is, Davis didn't die. He didn't die till the 1890s. He lived on and on. And this is the plan for Lyndhurst. All of that is an addition that he made. Very fancy, beautiful Gothic work. But it is exactly contemporary with the Griswold House in Newport, Rhode Island, designed by Richard Morris Hunt, who's going to become one of the famous architects of the latter 19th century, introducing the stick style. Meanwhile, Davis is designing castellated stone houses, very like the ones he did in Llewellyn Park, or even later in 1877, a new headquarters for the Long Island Historical Society in Brooklyn, which looks nothing except like his classical revival, Greek revival building that he did with Ithiel Town 40 years before this. Davis, without Downing, got stuck, and he did the same thing over and over again, even as new architects came, introduced new styles. The Watts Sherman Wetmore House in Newport, designed by H. Richardson with Stanford White, is a precursor of all the shingle style, Queen Anne style architecture that's going to become really prominent in the late 19th century. And Davis did not like this. He did not sign on. He spends a lot of time doing designs and not getting commissions because he kind of outlived his style, sadly. Calvert Vaux's only published book of designs, The Villas and Cottages from 1864, was dedicated with sincere respect to Carolyn Downing and the memory of her husband, Andrew J. Downing. And he also had a design for memorial to A.J. Downing that was erected in 1856. Calvert Vaux, I think, genuinely loved his employer and genuinely respected the work he did. Vaux did marry an American, and his first child, a son, was named Downing. And Downing Vaux grew up not to be an architect, but carrying the name of two great American architects. So although Downing is buried in Cedar Hill Cemetery in Newburgh, there's a memorial to him in Washington, D.C., near the old Smithsonian, near what would have been his great contribution to design, which would be the redesign of the Washington Mall. But I would argue that his really great contribution to design was popularizing the Gothic cottage, the center gable, the Italianate house, through a collaboration with Davis that was unmatched, shall we say, in its ability to transform taste in America. Thank you.
All right. Janet, that was just fabulous. A wonderful survey of all these interesting ideas and lovely things. Everybody, we have an opportunity to come up with some questions, and there was already some questions in the chat, but I wanted to start off with one. You mentioned that Downing didn't go to school for landscape architecture, and I don't know whether, and Davis had apprentice. Is that correct?
Davis was trained as an artist. He had art training. He had training as a printer, lithographer, but he then trained as an architect in the office of Ithiel Town.
So here's a question: when did the teaching of architecture as something you go to school for, not just as an apprentice, when did that come into being, and when did people begin to see architecture as a separate profession that people would be doing?
When it changes from being something a builder does, a master builder becomes an architect. He names himself that. It is after the Civil War. It is after that whole apprenticeship completely breaks down, and MIT is the first American school of architecture, and it opened in 1866, and followed by Cornell, followed by Penn, followed by Columbia, and then there are more. But it's a post-Civil War phenomenon, along with the rise of a professional organization called the American Institute of Architects. Mm-hmm. And in fact, Davis was a founding member of that in the 1850s, and then he quit because he didn't like the direction things were going, which wasn't his direction.
So we have a question. There's a variety of designs here. Any sense of how much it costs to build a home like this? Just in terms of who could do it? Like for example, in the Dearman map that had two images of Downing's cottages, so to speak. Mm-hmm. How much would it cost, and you know what that would mean today in terms of
I don't know what it would mean today, but they were certainly, that kind of cottage is being marketed as a middle class housing, but it's a middle class professional. The house in Llewellyn Park, I know, the McKim Nicholson house. Llewellyn Park is a very expensive place. The guy who built it, though, was a minister, so he's a professional person. there's another article in Downing written by a, a self-described country person who would like a nice house where he can have people over and also have his family. This is very, and there are cottages that are like laborers' cottages, but clearly those are intended to be parts of larger estates, that there's a big house and then they have these cute little cottages in back. I think it's more upper middle class, even, at the time, the George Vail house, the guy was in Congress. That's a big pile of house made of stone. That was not a cheap house to do. On the other hand, the balloon framing, the nails, the technology of building was really changing and becoming cheaper. So you see prices on some of these from the post-Civil War period, and they're talking about $1,000, $2,000, $2,500. That's assuming you have the land. That's assuming you have access to the builders. I have no idea how to translate that into modern prices. Sorry. I think the short answer is it ain't cheap, but they're not. Obviously, the Lyndhursts and the other things are in a whole different stratosphere of economic value.
So you mentioned in your talk, there's another question about copyright and how these pattern books would be used by other people. And I remember reading that the images of the Downing cottages on the Dearman map may not have been done with authorization, that Downing was very unhappy about his use of his pattern books in other places. Do you know how this played out back then? What?
But you're not the only one that has them. It shows up in periodicals and it shows up for decades. And he could have been unhappy, but he is actually getting quite rich off of this. So yeah, I saw, and he stole from other people too. So I don't know that there's unhappiness here.
So maybe that's just the architectural approach of whether you're stealing or borrowing ideas.
Borrowing, inspired by, right. Yeah. I mean, certainly once it was let loose, into the book form, it was there for somebody else to, I mean, we're not Xerox copying, we're making, a hard copy and probably a lithograph or an etching and then reprinting it. But it absolutely was used over and over and over again. And there was certainly no copyright and no permission and no access fee.
So you mentioned Lyndhurst, which is obviously just north of Irvington. Do you know of, in your research, have you come across any other homes that still exist in Irvington or Dobbs Ferry or this side of the Hudson that reflect one of those Downing images?
You need to invite me up for a couple of days to scout that out. I don't, it's not my turf. And I have to say, sometimes these things, I drive by them for years and then all of a sudden hit the brakes and go, oh my God, I never looked at that. I can see it now. I wish I knew. I'm sure they're there. I cannot believe there aren't some there.
So one person just put into the chat that, there was the Dow's family was a well-known family here in Irvington, and they had this gigantic mansion called Charleston. But there was a gatehouse, and the gatehouse on Dow's Lane, which is still there, is an L-shaped front and an Italian style. Query whether that, how much of that reflected some of these various styles you've mentioned and things like that.
Oh yeah.
One thing. Yeah, it's Dow's. Yeah, it's on Dow's Lane.
Okay.
And, I can send you some information about it, but it's a beautiful little house. One of the nice things about Irvington is that there are a number of examples of older homes, probably not from before 1850 or so, but there are older homes that may reflect some of these styles. So we'd love to have you come up and wander around and see some of the architecture up here.
Yeah. No, they are everywhere. The New York suburbs are lousy with these things. You just have to look for them and appreciate them because we are the market they aimed for. These books were published in New York. They're about being within commuting distance of the city. oftentimes with, lovely views or fresh air, yada, 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 like all the suburbs were advertised to be. So we are the market for Downing and Davis designs. So they should be there.
So apropos of that, there's a question, were there houses and landscaping reflecting Downing and Davis's style that are outside of like New York and Philadelphia, the major cities? You've shown photographs of houses from across the country.
Mm-hmm.
Do they exist across the country generally?
There's a great one in Northern California, okay, sorry, Montano, house that's absolutely a Downing house, and I didn't have a good enough picture of it, so I didn't include it. And the fort in Oregon, and yes, these exist, not so much in the South. Davis did work in the South, and he designed some very large houses in the South, designed some institutions. Downing visited South once and said, nope, not interested, don't like this place. And he did, none of his work includes any examples. Sometimes in the pattern book, it's like this house was built in Rhinebeck, this house was built in Irvington, this house was built in North Carolina. He was not a fan. So you don't see as much, but you see Davis work in Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina. Davis did the capital of Indiana, of Ohio, of a couple other Midwest states that, serious architecture out in the Midwest. I'm sure I know there's several in suburban Chicago area. So they are around anywhere a train could go. You could put this book, really, that's the thing about the United States. Once trains open up the West, you can get the lumber, you can get the books, you can get the nails, and anywhere they can go, you're likely to see these.
So people are putting in the chat just references to famous old homes around here, whether or not they're reflected from David, like Washington Irving's Sunnyside.
Yes, much romantic.
Yeah, there's the Octagon House, which is a beautiful home here that's been restored.
That's a whole different lecture. I think we got to do that. But
okay, we'll have you come back in the Octagon House. And then, Hamilton's Nevis that was here, which was built again in the 1835. So and that was in the more classical style.
Mm-hmm.
So there is a range of old homes here that reflect an interesting spread of architecture across the years. Sunnyside, which was built about 1852. Sunnyside, but Strawberry Hill. So there's a variety of interesting
Absolutely.
homes. We'd love to have you come. And I'm just kind of curious, do you just kind of walk around into people's yards and start taking photographs? Is that what you have to do when you're doing this kind of research?
Yeah.
Okay.
Don't shoot me.
Don't shoot you. Okay. All right. I don't think we have any more questions. So what I like to do now is I like to invite Veronica to come back on and just say a few final words. Veronica, if you could rejoin, you're there. Oops. Back again, if you can. Fabulous.
Hi there. Here I
yes.
am. Okay. Oh, thank you, Janet, for such a wonderful, beautifully arranged presentation for us. You gave us a whole world of knowledge. And if I can add my own 2 cents, there's a beautiful home on Oliphant Avenue in Dobbs Ferry designed by Calvert Fox, if anybody is up that hill in that neck of the woods. And then 3 pristine Gothic revival cottages on Maple Avenue in Hastings, if anyone is driving around that area.